The light is going out of the afternoon in slow, unhurried degrees, the way it always does in autumn, pulling back from the fields and the hedgerows and the long muddy stretch of road, as though gathering itself toward some distant place. The sky to the west holds a wash of pale gold and soft amber, colors without great warmth in them now, colors that belong more to memory than to the present air, which has grown cool and carries on it the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves and the faint sweetness of wood smoke, drifting from some farmstead hidden behind a rise in the land. The road itself is narrow here, as most country roads are in this season, worn down by cartwheels and the passage of animals and feet into twin ruts of dark mud that gather every puddle and pull the recent rains have left behind. Along either side the hedgerows grow thick and tangled, hawthorn and blackthorn and old elder, the leaves gone mostly to rust and amber and a deep bruised yellow, a few still clinging with determination to their branches, while the rest have given themselves over to the verges and the ditches, where they lie in soft, settling drifts. The fields beyond the hedges are quiet, the harvest long gathered in, the stubble pale and low, and here and there a crow moves slowly across the open ground, unhurried, attending to its own concerns. It is along this road that a small number of travelers are making their way in the diminishing light, moving at the careful pace of people who have been walking or riding since the morning hours, and who carry the particular weariness of a long autumn day in their bodies. There are 4 of them in all, though they are not a single party in any formal sense, having rather fallen into proximity over the course of the afternoon, the way travelers on a quiet road naturally drift together without much ceremony. The merchant is the most substantial of the group, in both bearing and load, a broad-shouldered man of middle years, his cloak of heavy wool drawn close about him, its hem carrying a dark border of mud from the road. He rides a solid, patient horse, a dun-colored animal with a white star on its forehead, and behind him on a lead rope comes a second horse, this one loaded with panniers of oiled cloth, pressed softly against its flanks as it walks. The merchant has made this journey, or ones very like it, many times before, and his posture in the saddle speaks of long familiarity with roads and distances, though by this hour of the day, even familiarity cannot entirely keep the tiredness from the set of his shoulders. A little behind him, and slightly to one side, where the road widens briefly, walk the 2 pilgrims, a man and a woman of somewhat older years, both on foot, both carrying the long staff that is the mark of those traveling to a shrine. They have walked the better part of 20 miles today, and it shows in the careful way they place each step, feeling for the firmer ground within the mud, leaning lightly on their staves with each stride. Their clothing is plain and well worn, suited to the road rather than to comfort, and around the neck of each hangs a small token, a badge of lead or pewter from an earlier pilgrimage, catching what little light remains. They walk with a quiet companionship, exchanging few words now, as people do when they have been together all day, and have arrived at the part of the afternoon where silence is a kind of rest in itself. Last among them, a few paces to the rear, comes the craftsman, a younger man, lean and angular, with a pack strapped across his back, that holds his tools wrapped carefully in cloth. He is a woodworker by his hands, which are marked by the particular small scars and calluses of someone who works with chisels and planes, and by the faint smell of sawdust that clings to his coat even now. He has said little to the others, since the road brought them together near midday, content to fall into the rhythm of the group without much conversation, and he walks with a kind of inward steadiness, his eyes moving over the hedgerows and the fields, as though noting the grain of the world around him. The wind stirs through the trees at intervals, a sound like a long, slow breath, and it carries down the leaves in small, spinning cascades that drift across the road and catch against the travelers' boots and the legs of the horses. Somewhere off to the north, past a stand of oaks whose branches have grown nearly bare, there comes the low, repeated calling of cattle, a sound that travels easily through the still air, soft and unhurried, belonging entirely to the rhythm of the end of a working day in the countryside. A small flock of starlings moves across the sky in that particular flowing, shape-shifting way of theirs, their forms against the pale light there, and then gone, vanished behind the tree line to the west. The road bends here, following the line of an old field boundary, and as the travelers round the curve, the hedgerow gives way briefly to a gap, a place where a gate has stood for many years, its posts worn smooth, and through this gap one can see across a stretch of pasture to where at the far side a cluster of trees stands dark against the fading sky. And there, among the trees, or rather just beyond them where the road continues its descent toward lower ground, there is a light. It is a small thing at this distance, wavering very slightly in the air, the warm orange of a torch or a lantern set outside a building, but it is unmistakably a light of human making, a light that belongs to a place of shelter and warmth, rather than to the open fields. The merchant sees it first, and shifts his weight in the saddle, and his horse seems to sense the change, and lifts its head a little, ears forward. The pilgrims see it a moment later, the woman touching her companion's arm and nodding toward the trees without speaking. The craftsman, further back, raises his eyes from the road and holds still for a moment, the pack on his back settling as he pauses, before he begins walking again with a slightly more purposeful step. The light does not move or flicker dramatically. It simply holds its place among the trees, steady and small and warm against the growing dark, a fixed point in the blue-gray of the autumn evening. And the road leads toward it, with the gentle sureness of a road that has been leading travelers to this particular place of rest for a very long time. The fields on either side are growing indistinct now, their edges softening into the dusk, and the mud of the road is dark and quiet underfoot, and the wind passes once more through the branches overhead, loosening a few last leaves into the air, and the travelers move on through it all, steadily and without haste, following the light. The inn emerges slowly from the trees and the fading light, the way things do at dusk, when the eye adjusts gradually to what it is seeing, the shapes resolving themselves out of shadow and branch and the general dimness of the autumn evening. It is not a large building, nor a grand one. It sits close to the road, as wayside inns have always tended to do, settled into the earth with the comfortable solidity of something that has stood in one place through a great many seasons, and intends to stand through many more. The walls are timber-framed in a manner common to this part of the countryside, the heavy oak beams running vertical and horizontal and diagonal across the face of the building, the spaces between them filled with a mixture of clay and straw and horsehair that has been smoothed and whitewashed and patched again over the years, until it holds a quality somewhere between cream and gray in the failing light, a surface that catches what little glow remains in the sky and gives it back softly. The roof is thatch, deep and thick, cut in an even line above the upper story and overhanging the walls on all sides by a generous measure, so that the rain, which has been frequent in this season, falls clear of the walls and into the mud of the yard below, rather than soaking through to the plaster. The thatch is old in places, new in others, lighter straw laid over darker, in the patches that have been renewed most recently, and along the ridge line there is a slow curl of smoke, rising from the great central chimney, moving upward with unhurried ease into the darkening sky, pale gray against the deeper gray of the clouds gathering from the west. That thread of smoke is visible for some distance along the road, and it is part of what draws the traveler's eye, even before the building itself can be clearly made out. The yard lies between the road and the inn's front door, enclosed on two sides by low outbuildings and on the third by the stable block, which runs along the far edge of the yard in a long, low construction of the same timber and plaster work as the inn itself, its roof lower and less carefully tended, its smell already reaching across the yard on the cool evening air, the warm, living smell of horses and hay and old wood, not unpleasant, familiar to anyone who has traveled the roads of this countryside and knows what a stable at evening means. Against the near wall of the stable block there stands a long stone water trough, dark with years of use, the water inside it perfectly still, in the absence of wind here in the sheltered yard, reflecting in a dim and wavering way the last light of the sky above. The yard surface is packed earth and straw and a quantity of mud, tamped down by the coming and going of many boots and hooves over many years, so that it has a quality almost like stone in the drier months, and something much more yielding in the wet. Tonight it is soft underfoot, marked with the impressions of the day's traffic, the round prints of hooves, and the broader marks of wagon wheels still visible in the darker patches near the gate. A wooden post stands near the entrance to the yard, and from it there hangs the inn sign. A flat board, cut to a simple shape, and painted with some device that the darkness and the years of weather have made difficult to read clearly. It may be a bush, or a wheel, or a crown of some kind, the paint worn in places and touched up in others, but the sign itself is legible enough in its function, swinging very slightly in the last breath of the evening wind, its chain making the faintest sound as it moves. The front door of the inn faces the yard and is reached by a single step of worn stone, pale and smooth in the center where feet have crossed it countless times, the edges still rough and dark with the original cut of the stone. The door itself is heavy oak, its planks thick and darkened with age and the repeated application of grease and handling, its iron hinges broad and solid in the way that the hinges of working doors in this period tend to be, made to last and to bear weight and to keep out weather. The door stands slightly ajar, not fully open, not closed, but a few inches open, so that through the gap there comes, barely perceptible at this distance across the yard, the thinnest thread of warmth, the faintest suggestion of the air inside meeting the air outside. It is the smell that reaches the travelers first, before the warmth can properly be felt, before the eye can see anything through the narrow opening of the door. Wood smoke, certainly, the particular rich and resinous smell of oak, burning on a large hearth that has been burning for many hours, deep and settled into the fabric of the building, not sharp or acrid, but slow and full, the kind of smell that has soaked into the plaster and the timber and the rushes on the floor over many years of fires lit and tended and banked and lit again. Beneath the wood smoke there are other things, harder to name separately. Old wood itself, the dry, faintly sweet smell of the oak beams and the planks of the floor, seasoned beyond seasoning now into something almost mineral. Damp straw, the smell of the yard and the stable carried in on boots and hems, present in every corner of a place like this, and under everything a faint yeasty warmth that speaks of ale, of bread baked earlier in the day, of the lived and working smell of a busy household at the end of its busiest hours. The travelers cross the yard one by one, their boots finding the firmer patches of ground with the instinctive caution of the experienced road traveler. The merchant leads his horse toward the stable, glancing at the inn door as he passes. The pilgrims move more directly toward the door, the woman adjusting the bundle she carries on one shoulder, her companion a half step behind, both of them inclining slightly toward the warmth, the way that cold and weary people tend to incline, not hurrying precisely, but with the natural gravity of the tired toward the comfortable. The craftsman comes last into the yard, passing through the gate and pausing for a moment as he always does in new places, looking at the shape of the building against the sky, noting the chimney smoke, the shuttered windows on the upper story, where a faint light shows at one edge of the timber, the general aspect of the place. The building holds the last of the daylight against its pale plaster walls in the way that whitewashed things do, holding brightness a little longer than the air around them, so that the inn seems for a moment almost to glow with its own pale luminescence against the darkening sky and the dark mass of the stable block and the deeper darkness of the trees beyond. Then the light shifts once more, settling lower, and the inn becomes simply what it is, a solid, low, warm-smelling place at the edge of the road, its door standing open by a few patient inches, the smoke from its chimney moving slowly upward into the evening, its yard quiet and familiar-smelling, waiting, as it has waited on so many evenings before this one, for the travelers crossing the yard to reach the worn stone step, to push the heavy door a little further open. The innkeeper has been at work since well before the last light began to fail outside, moving through the common room and back again with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has performed these same preparations through more evenings than could easily be counted. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes only from long repetition, from the doing of a thing in the same place across many seasons, until the hands know the work before the mind has consciously directed them, and the innkeeper moves with exactly that quality of settled, embodied knowing, reaching for a candlestick on its shelf without looking, testing the give of an ale barrel's tap by the slightest pressure of a palm, gauging the heat of the fire from 3 paces away without needing to step closer. The innkeeper is a stout figure, broad through the shoulder and broader through the middle, built in the way of someone who has spent decades in close proximity to a kitchen, and whose work, though constant and demanding, involves more standing and directing and carrying than it does any single form of vigorous exertion. The face is round and weathered, creased at the corners of the eyes from years of squinting against smoke and sun in roughly equal measure, and the complexion is ruddy in the way of those who spend their days moving between the heat of a great hearth and the cold of an inn-yard, the skin never quite settling into one temperature for long. The hair, once darker, has gone to a mixed gray that is neither distinguished nor distressing, simply the color that hair becomes when enough years have passed over it, and it is gathered back from the forehead and pinned with practical economy, so as not to fall forward during the work of the evening. The clothing is solid and plain, a long wool tunic in a color that was once a warm brown and has faded across many washings to something softer and less definite, worn over a linen undershirt whose cuffs show at the wrists. Over this, a linen apron of considerable size and some considerable staining, the record of many suppers and many evenings of pouring and carrying and wiping, bound at the waist with a simple cord and descending nearly to the knee. The shoes are sturdy, the leather thick and well worn, resoled at least once by some local cobbler whose work has held well enough through another long season of flagstone floors and inn-yard cobbles. The hands are the hands of someone who works constantly with them, broad and capable, the knuckles pronounced, the skin dry and roughened at the fingertips from handling rope and wood and the iron of the pothooks, the nails trimmed short as a matter of practical necessity. These are hands that have poured 10,000 cups of ale, have kneaded bread and hauled wood and pressed the wax seal of more tallies and accounts than the innkeeper could reckon, and they move now with a calm assurance that is itself a kind of comfort to anyone who watches, the assurance of hands that know thoroughly what they are about. The first task of the evening's proper preparations has been the fire. The great hearth at the center of the common room had burned lower through the middle of the afternoon when there were few guests to tend to, and the innkeeper has spent some minutes building it back carefully, not to a roaring blaze, which would be wasteful and too hot for a room that will soon hold resting bodies, but to a steady, generous burn that will sustain itself through the evening hours without constant attention. Larger pieces of oak have been laid across the andirons at the back, their ends resting in the coals so that they catch slowly and will burn long. In front of these, smaller split wood has been arranged to carry the flame forward and distribute the heat evenly across the width of the hearth. The innkeeper knows by long experience precisely how to lay a fire that will last, how to read the color and behavior of the coals and adjust accordingly, and the fire now burns with a deep, rhythmic steadiness that suggests it will continue to do so for some hours without intervention. Next, the fresh rushes. The common room's floor is strewn with rushes in the way of most such establishments, cut marsh grass dried and spread in a layer across the flagstones, where it serves to soften the hardness of the floor underfoot, to absorb spills and the mud tracked in from the road, and to provide a small measure of insulation against the cold that rises from the stone in the deep of the night. The rushes are changed regularly, though not every day, and the innkeeper has decided tonight is the right evening for fresh ones, the old layer having become matted and darkened enough to warrant it. A young servant, a girl of perhaps 13 or 14, with her hair in a plain linen coif, and her expression one of careful concentration, has been directed to rake out the old rushes into a pile near the door and carry them out into the yard, and she is doing so now with a wide wooden rake, working her way steadily across the room, while the innkeeper moves around her, attending to other things, without either of them needing to acknowledge the other's presence or trajectory. The new rushes are in a bundle against the wall near the passage to the kitchen, bound with a length of cord, and they carry the dry, faintly sweet smell of cut grass, a smell that will fill the room when they are spread, and will mix pleasantly with the wood smoke and the ale. The ale barrels are in a cool alcove off the passage between the common room and the kitchen, set on their trestles with their taps facing outward in the orderly way that makes the drawing of ale in a busy evening a matter of efficiency rather than effort. The innkeeper has checked each barrel in turn, pressing a hand to the wood to feel the weight of the liquid within, testing each tap briefly with a cup to confirm a clean flow and sound flavor, checking that the bungs above are seated firmly. 2 of the barrels are full and recent, their ale still slightly lively and bright. A third is perhaps halfway emptied, good for several more evenings of moderate trade. A fourth, the smallest, is very nearly done, and the innkeeper makes a mental note of this with the automatic ease of someone who holds the inn's inventory, not in any written account but in a reliable internal reckoning that is rarely wrong. The candles are next. The inn keeps tallow candles of a modest, practical sort, not the refined wax candles of a wealthy household, but solid, serviceable things rendered from animal fat and rolled onto wicks of twisted rush fiber, which burn with a warm and slightly smoky flame, and a faint animal smell that is not unpleasant in a room already fragrant with wood smoke and cooking. The innkeeper sets them along the shelves that run at intervals around the walls of the common room, fitting each one to its iron holder with a practiced twist and trim of the wick where necessary, and places several more along the deep sill of the single window that faces the inn yard, where their light will be visible from outside as a soft beckoning glow to anyone still crossing the yard in the failing dusk. Not all of them are lit yet. That would be wasteful while the room is still empty of guests, but they are set and ready, and the tinder box rests on the shelf nearest the hearth, where it is always kept, within easy reach for the moment when it will be needed. The cook has been at work in the kitchen for the better part of the afternoon, and the smell of the pottage that has been simmering since mid-afternoon has by now thoroughly permeated the common room, a warm, herbed, faintly meaty smell that reaches the nose as something between a comfort and an invitation, the smell of a meal that is ready and waiting and will not disappoint. The innkeeper pauses at the kitchen doorway and exchanges a few quiet words with the cook, a lean and capable woman of middle years who stands at the hearth with a long-handled spoon and the expression of someone in complete authority over her domain. They discuss the evening's likely number of guests, what the pot holds, whether there is bread enough, and what the situation is with regard to the salt mead that was delivered 2 days prior. The conversation is brief and practical, and conducted in the low, mutually respectful tone of two people who have worked alongside one another long enough to have no need of ceremony. The stable boy is somewhere in the yard, or in the stable block itself, tending to the single horse that is already in residence, a plow horse left by a neighbor some days ago for a minor matter of shoeing and not yet collected, and the maidservant, older than the girl with the rushes, perhaps 17 or 18, is somewhere upstairs, where she has been directed to check that the sleeping pallets are in order and that there are sufficient blankets in the chest at the foot of the room, as the nights have grown noticeably colder these past several weeks, and the guests who arrive chilled and road-weary will be grateful for the weight of good wool over them before the evening is done. The innkeeper makes one more slow circuit of the common room, checking nothing in particular and everything in general, the way a person does when they know a space so thoroughly that any small wrongness would announce itself without needing to be looked for. The fire is steady, the floor is nearly clear of the old rushes, the candles are in their places, the ale is sound, outside the last of the daylight is completing its retreat, and the road is no longer visible through the gap in the shutters, only a deepening blue-gray that will shortly be darkness entire. The innkeeper folds both hands for a moment at the front of the apron, a brief and unconscious gesture of quiet satisfaction, and then turns back toward the passage to see what else the evening requires. The first to arrive is the merchant, whose heavy footsteps have been audible in the yard for a moment or two before the door swings inward, bringing with it a brief gust of cold evening air and the smell of damp earth and horse. He is a broad-shouldered man, well into his middle years, with a thick wool traveling cloak that has collected the dust and moisture of the road along its hem, and he pushes through the doorway with the practiced ease of a person who has made this same entrance at a great many inns across a great many seasons. The door closes behind him, and the warmth of the common room receives him at once, pressing against his cold, reddened face with a gentleness that makes him pause, just for a moment, in the space between the door and the room proper, as if giving the warmth time to make itself known. He stamps his boots twice on the worn stone just inside the threshold, a habit so deeply ingrained that it seems to require no conscious thought, and the cakes of dark mud that have been clinging to the sides and soles since the last wet stretch of road fall away onto the rushes with a series of soft, flat sounds. He draws back his hood and looks around the common room with a slow, assessing gaze, not suspicious, only the habitual taking stock of a man accustomed to evaluating spaces quickly and quietly. The fire pleases him. The candles are sufficient. The room smells of wood smoke and ale and something savory from the direction of the kitchen, and he nods to himself in the small, private way of a person whose expectations have been met. The innkeeper is already crossing the room toward him, wiping both hands on the front of the apron out of long habit rather than necessity, and the exchange of courteous words is brief and easy on both sides, the kind of conversation that has a comfortable shape to it, each part falling naturally into place. The merchant states his name, mentions that he has one horse requiring stabling and one pack animal besides, and asks after a sleeping place for the night and a supper when it can be managed. The innkeeper confirms the accommodation, names a price that the merchant accepts without particular protest, and calls through to the yard for the stable boy, whose quick footsteps are heard almost immediately on the cobbles outside. A small arrangement of coins passes between the merchant's large chapped hand and the innkeeper's steadier one, and the transaction settles into the fabric of the evening as naturally as everything else is done. The merchant allows himself to be relieved of his traveling pack by no one, keeping it close at hand as he moves toward the fire, though he does unpin his cloak and drape it heavily over the back of the nearest bench, where it hangs with the solid weight of wet wool, already beginning to steam faintly in the heat. He chooses a seat with an unobstructed view of the door, as many road-seasoned travelers tend to do, and sets his pack down beside his feet where he can feel its presence without looking. From within it, he draws a small ledger, bound in soft brown leather, and opens it across his knees, running one thick finger down a column of figures with the slow, concentrated attention of a man who has been meaning to do this for the last several miles, and is grateful at last for light sufficient to the task. The pilgrims arrive not long after, entering together in the way of people who have shared several days of walking and have grown accustomed to moving at the same pace. They are quieter in their entrance than the merchant was, their knock on the door preceding them with a diffidence that is something between courtesy and habit. The older of the two, a woman of perhaps 50 years, her face broad and weathered in a way that speaks of many outdoor hours, her gray cloak pinned neatly at the collar, steps inside first, and her companion follows close behind, a younger man, slender, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that he removes as soon as he is through the door, holding it in both hands in a manner that is almost ceremonial. Both of them carry a staff, slender and worn smooth at the grip, and both staves are set carefully against the wall beside the door, as if this too is an established part of the evening's ritual. They have less coin than the merchant, and the innkeeper is well accustomed to pilgrims and adjusts the conversation accordingly, not with any reduction in warmth, but with a practical directness that moves things along without dwelling on the matter of money any longer than needed. The arrangement is made, and the two pilgrims move to a bench not far from the fire, though they choose one slightly removed from the merchant, leaving a space between their small circle and his that is not unfriendly, but simply respectful of the different privacy each party carries with them. The woman sets down the modest cloth bundle she has been carrying across one shoulder and folds her hands over her knees, and for a moment both pilgrims bow their heads, and their lips move in something quiet and interior, a short prayer of thanksgiving for safe passage, or perhaps for the warmth itself, or for the meal that is coming, or for all of these things together. The murmur of it is barely audible, a sound softer than the fire. The craftsman is the last to come in, arriving some little while after the pilgrims, and he comes alone, as he has been traveling all day. He is younger than the merchant, somewhere in the earlier part of his 30s, a lean and capable-looking man with the particular hands of someone who works daily with tools, the knuckles large, the palms calloused, the fingers holding a kind of residual tension, even when at rest. He says very little at the door, offering his name and his coin with a quiet economy of words, and the innkeeper processes him with the same unhurried efficiency as the others. He hangs his own cloak on the peg nearest to him, straightens at once, and then makes directly for the fireplace with the directness of a person who has been cold for long enough. He stands before the fire for a time without sitting, his hands extended toward the warmth, with the palms open and facing the heat, and the expression on his face is one of pure and uncomplicated relief. After a while he rolls his shoulders back, first one, then the other, and tilts his head slowly to the side, working out the stiffness that a long day on the road settles into the neck and upper back of anyone who has spent hours carrying weight or hunching against the wind. He does this without self-consciousness, as a person does when fatigue becomes sufficiently complete that the body simply begins to attend to its own needs without ceremony. Then he lowers himself onto the bench nearest the hearth, stretching his legs out before him and crossing them at the ankle, and he rests his head back against the rough wall behind him with a slow exhalation that says more about the length of the day than any words might manage. The common room holds them all now, these three small clusters of tired humanity, each settled into their own quiet way of being present, and the room accommodates them without effort, as it has accommodated travelers through many years before this one. The fire speaks steadily in its own language of crackle and low breath. The candles on the shelves cast their small, patient circles of golden light across the pewter and the earthenware and the dark beams overhead. The smell of whatever is cooking in the kitchen has grown a little richer and closer, drifting under the passage door in warm, intermittent waves. Outside, the evening has become full night, and the wind makes a faint sound against the shutters, though inside it cannot be felt at all. The room has settled into a low and a comfortable hum of human presence, the scratch of the merchant's finger across his ledger, the soft murmur of the pilgrims exchanging a few words, the quiet creak of the craftsman's bench as he shifts his weight, and all of it is folded into the warmth and the firelight, contained and easy, the restless motion of the day at last arriving at its proper close. The maidservant comes through the passage door with the unhurried step of someone who has made this same crossing many times before, and she carries in both hands a broad wooden board on which 2 round loaves of bread have been set, their crusts dark and firm from a long afternoon in the bread oven, their tops split along a single crack where the dough rose and opened in the heat. She sets the board on the nearer of the 2 trestle tables, without ceremony, and the thump of it against the old wood is a soft, familiar sound, the sound of supper beginning. The loaves are still faintly warm, and where the crust is split, the interior crumb shows pale and dense, the kind of bread that has been made with rye and barley flour mixed together, sturdy and filling and with a mild, earthy sweetness underneath the char of its outer skin. The trestle tables themselves are long and plain, 2 heavy planks laid across their wooden supports and worn smooth across the middle, where generations of elbows and platters and clay jugs have passed. The grain of the wood shows through in places where the surface has been scrubbed clean, and along the edges the timber has darkened to a deep brown that holds the memory of 10,000 suppers. The benches on either side are of a similar plainness, thick and solid, without backs, so that the guests must hold themselves upright, or lean forward onto their elbows, which most of them do by degrees as the evening progresses and the warmth of the room takes the last stiffness from their shoulders. The great hearth dominates the far wall, and the iron crane that hangs over it is a solid blackened thing, fitted with hooks and chains from which the cooking pot has already been moved for the serving, though it still stands close by on its trivet at the hearth's edge, breathing a thread of steam from beneath its lid. The pot is a large one, deep enough to have held a full day's worth of pottage, and the smell that rises from it is thick and vegetable and good. Onions softened into the broth, dried peas and lentils that have swollen and given their starch to the liquid, herbs from the summer's drying bundled and simmered, and now removed, having left their quieter notes behind. There may be a little salt pork in there as well, or a bone or 2 that have done their slow work of enrichment through the long afternoon hours, and the broth itself has taken on a color somewhere between amber and deep brown, with a surface that shimmers gently in the firelight as the steam lifts from it. The maidservant ladles this pottage into earthenware bowls, one at a time, and carries them to the tables in careful pairs, the bowls dark and rounded, their rims a little uneven where the clay was turned by hand, and the glaze gathered in small pools at the base. Who has folded away his ledger and pushed it to the end of the bench, and one before each of the pilgrims, who receive theirs with a small, quiet inclination of the head that is neither elaborate nor empty, simply the natural acknowledgment of people for whom gratitude in small things is a practiced habit. The craftsman receives his bowl last, and wraps his large hands around it for a moment before he lifts his spoon, drawing some warmth directly from the earthenware into his palms. The ale comes next, poured from a clay jug that the innkeeper carries out personally, moving from guest to guest with an unhurried efficiency, filling the cups on the table without spilling, setting the jug down between pours with a practiced gentleness that keeps the liquid settled and clear. The ale is a middling sort, brewed not many days ago, amber and slightly cloudy, with a faint yeasty sourness underneath its mild sweetness that is not unpleasant, but is simply what ale is when it is honest and freshly made. The cups that receive it are wooden, smooth from use, the rims worn to a faint shine, and the sound of the jug being set down and the sound of the cups being lifted becomes part of the quiet rhythm of the room's breathing. Somewhere toward the later part of the meal, the maidservant brings out a roasted bird, or what remains of one, a hen that was turned on the spit through the afternoon and is now a deep, burnished brown, its skin drawn tight and crackling faintly when pressed, its flesh pulling easily from the bone with the gentle encouragement of a knife. She sets it on a wooden trencher in the center of the table, and there is no performance in the serving of it, no ceremony, only the practical business of food being shared among people who are hungry and tired and grateful for what is in front of them. The merchant cuts himself a portion with the small knife he carries at his belt. The pilgrims take modest pieces and eat slowly. The craftsman tears a piece of bread from the loaf and uses it to capture the juices that have pooled in the trencher's shallow depression. The bread is used for everything, as it always is, to scoop, to wipe, to carry other food to the mouth, and at the end of the meal, some of it will be thoroughly soaked through and eaten as a last yielding mouthful, and some of it may be left, and that which is left will find its way to the kitchen for another purpose, because in a household like this one, nothing is set aside without thought of its next use. The loaves are dense enough that they hold their shape through all of this handling, and even the crust, which might splinter and crumble if pressed too hard, yields slowly and in pieces that stay on the table rather than scattering to the floor. The candles on the shelves along the walls have been burning steadily since the innkeeper set them alight earlier in the evening, and by now they have settled into their proper rhythm, each one throwing its small and particular pool of golden light onto the pewter pieces arranged nearby, the plates and the lidded cups, and the one or two larger serving dishes that stand mostly for decoration, their surfaces dull and silver gray in the ordinary light of day, but warm and almost amber in the glow of the candles. The shelf nearest the door holds 3 such pieces, and the light catches the curve of each one differently, depending on the angle, so that one pewter cup shows a bright reflection near its rim, while another absorbs the light into its surface and gives back only a gentle gleam. The beam ceiling above is low enough that the tallest of the guests, standing, would need to mind his head at the central beam, and across its surface the years of wood smoke have laid down their slow, even darkening, so that the wood is now nearly black at the center of the room, and only a little lighter where the beams meet the walls. This darkness is not a fault of the room, but simply its age made visible. The accumulated evenings of fire and candle and cooking, all written into the timber in a language of soot and shadow. It makes the ceiling feel close and sheltering, rather than oppressive, the low sky of an interior world that holds its warmth carefully and does not let it rise and dissipate upward into cold air. The firelight moves across the faces of the guests in its unhurried, irregular way, brightening a cheekbone or the curve of a hand around a cup, then softening again as a log settles or the flames dip for a moment before recovering. The merchant's face, turned slightly toward the fire, is made ruddy and warm by it. The pilgrims, sitting side by side with their shoulders nearly touching, are caught in a shared pool of light that makes them seem closer to one another than perhaps they feel. The craftsman, a little further from the hearth, sits in a softer glow that rounds and quiets his features. All of them eat slowly, as people do when they are truly tired and the urgency of the day has finally released them, and the sounds of eating are small and unhurried, the scrape of a spoon against earthenware, the soft tearing of bread, the occasional swallow of ale, the gentle setting down of a cup. Outside, the wind continues its faint conversation with the shuttered windows, but inside the common room, in the warmth and the candlelight, and the slow, rich smell of bread and pottage and wood smoke and ale, there is only the deep, uncomplicated comfort of a meal taken in shelter at the end of a long road. while the common room holds its warmth in candlelight, and the travelers sit in their slow communion with the fire and the last of the evening's ale. The stable beyond the inn yard is already settling into its own particular quiet. The stable boy has been out there for some time now, moving through his work with the unhurried efficiency of someone who has performed these same tasks on enough evenings that his hands know what to do without being asked. He is a young person, not yet grown into his full height, with a serious manner about him that belongs to those who have been given real responsibility early and have taken it to heart. He carries the horn lantern with him as he moves from stall to stall, and its light is a gentle amber thing, not the bright, clarifying light of the common room's fire, but something softer and more contained, a small warm globe that illuminates whatever is directly before him and lets the rest of the stable remain in its comfortable dimness. The lantern is hung on an iron hook set into one of the thick, upright posts that support the roof, and from there it casts its glow across the central aisle of the stable in a way that is almost like a second, smaller hearth light, steady enough to work by, warm enough to soften the edges of the wooden stalls and the dark mass of hay packed into the loft above. The horses have been brought in, and their saddles and bridles removed some time past, during that busy period just after the travelers arrived, when the yard was briefly alive with the sounds of hooves on cobblestone and the murmur of instructions and the creak of straps being loosened. Now those saddles rest on their wooden racks along one wall, the leather still carrying the warmth of the animals and the dust of the road, and the bridles hang from their pegs, with their iron bits catching a faint gleam from the lantern. The stable boy runs a cloth over the leather of one saddle now, not with great urgency, but with the quiet care of someone who knows that tack left damp or dirty will only make more work the following morning. There are 3 horses in the stable tonight: the merchant's sturdy brown cob, broad-chested and calm, the pilgrim's smaller gray mare, and the craftsman's somewhat older animal, a patient roan with a white stripe along its nose that has seen many roads and long since made its peace with the world. Each of them has been given hay, pulled from the loft in great soft armfuls, and distributed into the wooden mangers that line the front of each stall, and the sound of them eating is one of the most restful sounds in all of the natural world, a slow tearing rhythmic sound, entirely without tension, the sound of creatures that are content and warm and have everything they need for the night. The stable boy brings a wooden bucket of water to each stall in turn, lifting it carefully over the low partition and setting it down where the horse can reach it without having to stretch. The brown cob drinks immediately and at length, its lips moving in the water with a quiet liquid sound, and then lifts its head with a kind of slow satisfaction, water dripping from its soft muzzle. The gray mare takes a few polite sips and then turns her attention back to the hay with an air of having made up her mind about priorities. The roan simply sniffs the bucket and then does not drink, which is entirely its own business. The straw on the floor of each stall is thick and dry, banked up at the edges by the stable boy's earlier work with a wooden fork, and the horses shift their weight in it with small, settling sounds, a hoof lifted and replaced, a flank leaning gently against a partition, a long breath released through wide nostrils into the warm air. The warmth itself is one of the great, unremarked gifts of a stable on a cold night. The bodies of 3 horses generate a considerable and gentle heat, and it mingles with the smell of the hay and the dry old wood of the walls and the faint lanolin scent of the horses' own coats, to create an atmosphere that is deeply and primally comfortable, warm and enclosed, and smelling of living things at rest. The stable boy walks the length of the aisle one more time, checking each stall with a glance that is quick but thorough. He presses his hand for a moment against the flank of the roan, feeling the steady warmth of the animal, and the roan turns its head slightly, and then turns it back again, unbothered. He checks that the hay in each manger is sufficient, that no water bucket has been knocked or overturned, that the latch on the door of each stall is properly seated. These are small tasks, but they are the tasks that matter, and he performs them with a kind of quiet seriousness that is its own form of care. Outside, the wind moves across the inn yard and finds the gap beneath the stable door, sending a thin current of cold air along the floor of the aisle. but it does not reach the stalls themselves, which are sheltered by their wooden walls and by the deep insulation of the hayloft above. The horses are warm, and the stable boy is warm, and the lantern on its hook burns with a small, steady perseverance that makes the surrounding dark seem not threatening, but simply natural, the darkness that belongs to late evening, to shelter, to rest. He takes the lantern down from its hook at last, holding it carefully at his side as he makes his way toward the stable door. He pauses at the threshold and looks back once, not from anxiety, but from the simple habit of a last check, and what he sees is the brown cob, and the gray mare and the patient roan, each in its stall, each settling into the slow, rhythmic work of rest, their shapes large and calm in the retreating light. Then he steps through the door and draws it shut behind him with a quiet, solid sound, and inside the stable the last trace of lantern light disappears, and the darkness closes in gently and completely. It is not an empty darkness, nor an uncomfortable one. The horses breathe in it with long, slow exhalations that fog faintly in the cold, and the hay rustles softly as one of them shifts, and somewhere in the thatch above, a small creature settles deeper into its nest. The stable holds all of this in its warm, dark quiet, the breath and the warmth and the slow, unhurried sounds of animals who are entirely at peace, and the night gathers around it without hurry, without urgency, as patient and encompassing as sleep itself. The door from the yard opens with a low creak, and the stable boy slips back into the warmth of the inn, and in the common room the evening has deepened in the quiet way that evenings do when no one has been watching them closely. The fire on the great hearth has burned down from its earlier brightness into something lower and steadier, a bed of coals beneath logs that have settled into themselves and now give off a thick, even warmth that reaches all the way to the far end of the room. The tallow candles on the shelves have burned down a little too, their flames standing still and straight in the windless air, each one casting its small pool of amber light onto the plaster wall behind it, and leaving the spaces between in soft, companionable shadow. The travelers are still at the tables, though the meal is long finished, and the earthenware bowls have been cleared away. What remains on the table is the ale jug, dark clay smoothed by many hands, and the cups around it, and the slow, unhurried shapes of people who have eaten well and warmed themselves thoroughly, and have nowhere particular to be until morning. The merchant has settled back on his bench, with his cup held loosely in both hands, his broad shoulders no longer carrying the tension of the road, his eyes half attending to the fire. The two pilgrims sit together at the near end of the table, their plain woolen cloaks folded over the bench beside them, and their voices when they speak are low and unhurried, suited to the hour. The craftsman has drawn his stool a little closer to the hearth, and sits with his elbows on his knees, looking into the coals in the comfortable and uncommitted way of a man whose thoughts are pleasantly empty. It is the merchant, and speaks first into the general quiet, and what he says is nothing remarkable, something about the road east of the valley, where the rains of the past fortnight have softened the track badly near the river crossing, and where a cart had been seen mired earlier in the week. His voice is even and unhurried, carrying the mild authority of someone who travels these roads often and has learned to observe them with the same professional attention he gives to the quality of cloth or the weight of a bale. He does not dramatize the road's difficulties, he simply notes them in the way that experienced travelers do, as facts to be stored and consulted, useful to whoever might be heading that way come morning. One of the pilgrims nods slowly at this and offers something in return, that the road they had come along from the west had been drier and firmer underfoot, stony in places but manageable, and that the bridge 2 miles back was holding well despite its age, its stones green with moss at the waterline, but solid enough. There is a quiet back and forth of this kind, a trading of road knowledge that is one of the oldest and most practical forms of conversation among people who move through the world on foot and on horseback, and it has a comfortable, worn quality to it, like a path that has been traveled many times. The ale jug makes its way around the table, and the merchant pours for himself, and then leans across to refill the nearer pilgrim's cup without being asked, a small gesture of easy generosity that passes without comment. The fire settles and a log shifts with a soft sound, sending a brief brightening of flame that moves across the faces at the table, and then subsides again into the steady glow. The craftsman does not speak, but he is listening, and his presence at the edge of the warmth, is easy and undemanding. The presence of a man who is content to be among people without needing to place himself at the center of them. Gradually the talk moves, as talk does by firelight and toward the end of an evening, from the practical to the more gently personal. The merchant mentions the market he is making for, a wool fair in a town some 3 days' ride to the north, where buyers come from considerable distances, and where the trading, when it goes well, repays the journey many times over. He does not boast of this. He speaks of it in the matter-of-fact way of a man describing his work, noting the qualities he looks for in fleece, the length and softness of the staple, the cleanliness of the clip, the reputation of the particular flocks from the upland farms. And there is in his voice a genuine regard for the material itself, for the particular weight and texture of good wool between the fingers, for the way certain fleeces take the light. It is clear that he has handled many thousands of such bales over many years, and has not grown indifferent to them. The pilgrims, when the merchant's conversation has found a natural pause, speak a little of where they are going. It is a shrine some days further along the road, a place of some local devotion connected with an early saint, situated on a gentle hillside near a spring. They have been walking for 9 days. They say this without complaint, in the mild and settled tone of people who undertook this journey in full knowledge of what it would require, and who have made their peace with its demands. There is something in the way they speak of the shrine, not with high emotion, but with a quiet and considered anticipation, that suggests it means something real to them, something they have carried with them through all the muddy miles and the tired evenings, and that they expect to find waiting for them when they arrive, steady and unchanged. The craftsman listens to all of this. He shifts once on his stool, reaching out to adjust a log at the edge of the fire with a practiced nudge, and the coals underneath glow more brightly for a moment before settling back. He is a man of few words, or perhaps simply a man who finds that the words of others are sufficient company for the evening, and there is no awkwardness in his silence. He refills his own cup when the jug comes near enough, and he nods once or twice at something the merchant says, and his face in the firelight is simply a face at rest, quiet and unhurried. The common room has its own sounds beneath the conversation, sounds that are so steady and familiar that they become part of the silence, rather than an interruption of it. The fire breathes in its slow way, and the wood settles and contracts, and somewhere toward the back of the room, a shutter moves very gently in a draught too faint to feel, tapping once against its frame before going still again. The candle nearest the door has burned down to its last inch, and is throwing a slightly unsteady light now, its flame wavering almost imperceptibly in that same faint current of air. On the shelves, the pewter reflects it in long softened gleams. The talk does not end so much as it slows and diminishes, the way water in a stream slows as it reaches a wider, calmer place. There are longer pauses between exchanges, and the pauses are comfortable, filled with the looking into the fire that requires no words and offers its own form of companionship. The merchant drains the last of his cup and sets it down with a quiet sound on the table. One of the pilgrims has folded his hands together loosely on the wood before him, in a posture that is close to prayer and close to simple rest, the fingers relaxed, the head bowed slightly toward the warmth. The other has turned to look at the fire with the particular unfocused attention of someone whose thoughts, if they are moving at all, are moving very slowly and without any destination in mind. The fire gives off its warmth in long, even waves, and the room is full of the smell of wood smoke and the faint residual sweetness of the supper that has been eaten, and the ale that has been drunk, and the damp wool of cloaks drying slowly near the hearth. All of it is deeply familiar, the smell of an inn at the end of an evening, and it settles over the travelers like something almost tangible, like the first heaviness of sleep beginning to gather at the edges of the waking mind. The ale jug rests now at the center of the table, empty, and no one moves to refill it. The evening has reached that quiet point past which it will not deepen further, only soften, only slow, drawing everything gradually toward the long and dreamless rest that waits upstairs in the cool and rustling dark. Behind the common room, separated from it by a low doorway hung with a length of undyed wool, the kitchen has entered its own particular hour. The supper has been carried out and eaten, and the plates and bowls have begun to find their way back through that doorway on a wooden tray. And now the cook and the maidservant move through the kitchen in the unhurried and practiced way of people who have performed these same tasks at the end of every evening for as long as they can clearly remember. The kitchen is a smaller room than the common room, lower ceilinged, and the air within it is dense with the warmth of a fire that has been burning since early morning. The walls are of the same dark timber as the rest of the inn, and they have been stained over many years by the rising of fat and steam, until they have taken on a color that is close to the color of old honey, warm and dark, and faintly lustrous in the firelight. The floor is stone, broad flat slabs laid close together, their surfaces worn smooth by countless footsteps, and worn slightly hollow in the places where the cook stands most often, before the fire, before the long wooden work table, at the shelf where the salt box and the small jar of dried herbs are kept. These hollows are barely visible, but they are there, shaped by the patient repetition of daily work across many seasons. From the rafters overhead hang bundles of dried herbs, tied with lengths of coarse string, bunches of thyme and rosemary gone papery with drying, ropes of onions whose papery skins catch the faintest movement of air and turn very slowly, flat braids of dried mushrooms, and a long skein of something that might be dried apple rings, pale and curled and faintly translucent. The smell of all of these things together mingles with the smell of the fire and the smell of the supper that was cooked here hours ago, the deep, fatty richness of the pottage, the ghost of roasted meat, the starchy warmth of bread that was baked this morning and is now mostly eaten, its residual presence still caught somewhere in the grain of the wooden work table and in the cloth that covers the bread basket. The maidservant carries the tray of used earthenware to the work table and sets it down with a sound that is quiet but solid, the particular weight of stacked bowls finding the wood. She begins to scrape each bowl in turn with a wooden spoon, turning the remnants of pottage and bread into a clay vessel set aside for that purpose, nothing wasted, everything accounted for. The scraping is a small, steady sound, rhythmic and soft, and it fills the kitchen in an unobtrusive way, the way that ordinary working sounds do, sounds that the ear notes once and then allows to become simply part of the air of the room. Has turned her attention to the great iron pot that hangs from its hook above the fire. The pot has been emptied, and it is still warm to the touch, and she wraps her hands in a folded cloth before she lifts it from its hook and carries it to the work table with the particular careful ease of someone very familiar with the weight and heat of iron. She sets it down and takes up a rough cloth and wipes the inside of the pot, not scrubbing, only wiping away the loose residue of the evening's cooking, turning the cloth over once to a clean surface and wiping again. The pot will hang clean and empty through the night, ready for the morning's work, and this small act of leaving things in order for the morning is one that the cook performs without particular thought, the way that many necessary and quietly important acts are performed, not solemnly, but steadily, with a kind of deep habit that carries its own contentment within it. The two women exchange very few words. There is little need for words in work that both of them know well and have done together many times. Occasionally one will reach past the other for a cloth or a bowl, or the maidservant will set a stack of cleaned earthenware at the edge of the shelf, and the cook will move it slightly to a more stable position without comment. And in these small adjustments, there is a kind of easy fluency that long familiarity produces between people who work together in a small space. The silences between them are not empty silences. They are the silences of people who are comfortable enough together that words are only one of many ways of keeping company. The fire in the kitchen hearth has burned lower than it was at midday, or even at the height of the supper preparation, and it gives off now a broad, low, orange-red glow, rather than the more vigorous flames of the cooking hours. The cook will bank it for the night before she sleeps, covering the coals with a careful layer of ash to hold the heat through the dark hours, so that in the morning the fire can be coaxed back to life from the still warm heart of it without the slower work of striking fresh sparks. This banking of the fire is an act that sits somewhere between habit and care, between practical necessity and something almost like the tucking away of a living thing for the night. But that is still a little while off. First there is the rest of the clearing. The maidservant lifts the clean bowls to the shelf where they rest in a row. their mouths turned downward in a way that keeps the dust out, each one nested close to the next. The clay jugs are rinsed with a small measure of water from the bucket kept near the hearth, and set upright beside the bowls. The wooden spoons are wiped and laid in their place. The work table itself is swept with a brush of bundled twigs across its surface, the crumbs falling to the stone floor, and then the floor around the work table is swept as well, the brush moving in long, slow arcs, gathering the crumbs and the ash dust and the occasional fallen leaf of dried herb that has come loose from its bundle in the rafters. There is something deeply calming in watching the kitchen compose itself for the night in this methodical way, each object returning to the place where it is kept, each surface made clean and ready, the work of the day folded away, like cloth into a drawer. The room settles around its own order with a kind of quiet satisfaction, the same satisfaction that attends any work that has been done thoroughly and with care, and that is now, for the time being, complete. The maidservant pauses at the work table and stretches her arms above her head, a slow, private gesture, and then lets them fall. The cook has moved to the hearth, and kneels there, drawing the ash forward over the coals with a flat-bladed iron tool, working carefully and methodically from one edge of the fire to the other, covering the glowing orange with a smooth gray blanket. The glow dims but does not disappear entirely, visible here and there as a faint ember light beneath the ash, and the room softens around it, growing a shade dimmer and a shade more still. When the banking is done, the cook sits back on her heels for a moment and looks at the fire she has covered, and there is in that pause a kind of natural completion, a moment of rest between one thing and the next. The kitchen holds the warmth that has accumulated in it over the long day, the smell of herbs and ash and old bread, and the faint ghost of the evening supper rises and settles and is simply the smell of this room, the same smell it has had for many years, constant and unhurried, and deeply, quietly familiar. The innkeeper has been watching the evening from the far end of the common room for some time, standing near the doorway that connects the public space to the back passage, one hand resting lightly against the doorframe. It is a habitual posture, the posture of a person who has learned over many seasons to read the temperature of a room without appearing to study it, to know when the last of the evening's conversations has reached its natural end, and the guests have begun to settle into their own quietness. That moment has come now, and the innkeeper moves. From a small shelf beside the back passage there is kept a rushlight, a length of dried rush that has been drawn through melted tallow and left to set, producing a slender, pale candle of modest ambition, its flame small and given to wandering when the air shifts. The innkeeper takes it up and touches it to the nearest candle flame, letting it catch, watching the small fire establish itself at the tip, before turning away into the passage. The rounds begin at the front of the inn, which is the proper place to begin. The heavy oak door stands in its frame at the end of the entrance passage, and the innkeeper moves toward it with the unhurried certainty of someone who has made this same walk on every night of countless years. The rushlight throws its pale, wavering glow ahead, along the floor, illuminating the worn stone flags and the dark timber walls in a light that is barely more than a suggestion, that turns familiar shapes into gentle mysteries, and makes the passage seem slightly longer than it is by daylight. The door is already shut against the night, as it has been since the last traveler came through hours ago. The innkeeper lays one hand on the great wooden bar and lifts it slightly, testing its seating in the iron brackets, and then presses it firmly home again. The bar makes a soft, dense sound as it settles, a sound of solidity and finality, and the innkeeper is satisfied. One hand moves briefly to the door itself, pressing flat against the oak grain, feeling for drafts at the edges of the frame. There is a faint coolness at the lower left corner where the wood has settled over the years and left the smallest of gaps, and the innkeeper notes it as a thing that has been noted before and will be attended to in the daylight hours when such work is possible. For tonight the bar holds, and the door is as sealed as it will be, and that is sufficient. The common room comes next. Most of the candles that were lit earlier in the evening have been allowed to burn down through the natural course of things, their wax pooled and hardened in the clay holders, their flames long since spent. But 2 or 3 still burn on the far shelf, and the innkeeper crosses the room toward them with the rushlight held low. Moving between the benches and around the end of the long trestle table, stepping carefully in the dim space. The sleeping guests have already gone upstairs, and the common room is empty of waking bodies. The benches sit in their familiar places. The table holds its ordinary darkness. The great hearth glows softly on one wall, its fire banked and breathing slowly as the cook left it, and the innkeeper pauses before it and extends a hand toward the warmth. Not a dramatic gesture, simply a quiet assessment, the palm held flat and level at a distance from the hearthstone, reading the heat that rises from the covered coals. The fire is safe. Its warmth is the warmth of a thing that has been properly contained, measured, and covered. Not a fire that runs toward wood it should not reach, but a fire that rests within its proper bounds and will hold its glow until morning with no intervention needed. The innkeeper lowers the hand and is still for a moment before the hearth, simply present with it, the way one might stand at the edge of a quiet field in the dusk, not because there is anything to be done, but because stillness itself has its use. Then the 3 remaining candles on the far shelf are pinched out, one after another, and the common room settles into a dimness broken only by the faint amber breath of the banked coals. The back passage again, and then a brief turning aside to the door that opens onto the yard. This door is heavier than it looks, with iron fittings that have darkened to a deep rust brown over the years, and it opens outward onto the cobbled yard with a slow reluctance, admitting a breath of night air that is cold and faintly damp, and carries with it the smell of autumn earth and old straw and the particular cool cleanness of the open sky. The innkeeper steps out into the yard and stands very still. The night is quiet. There is no wind to speak of, only a slight movement of air that comes and goes without urgency, turning the rushlight's flame sideways for a moment and then releasing it. Above, the sky is partially obscured by cloud, with here and there a star visible in the breaks, cold and remote. The yard itself is dark and empty and still. The stable block stands in its usual place along the far wall, its great door pulled shut for the night, and from within it there is no sound beyond the faintest settling movement of an animal shifting its weight in its stall. The torchlight that burned in the bracket beside the yard entrance has been extinguished already, done earlier in the evening as one of the smaller tasks of the night, and the yard lies in its own kind of resting dark. The innkeeper listens. This is the particular work of this moment, not looking, not doing, but simply listening to the night and what it holds or does not hold, attending to the sounds of the road beyond the yard's outer gate and to the broader silence of the countryside beyond. There is nothing to hear that is not already accounted for. A distant sound, animal or perhaps the very faint movement of branches somewhere in the fields, comes and goes and is replaced by nothing. The road outside is empty. The night is as it should be, as it has been on every quiet evening that has passed through this inn over the long years. The innkeeper goes back inside and draws the yard door shut, pressing it into its frame with one palm and sliding the small iron bolt home with care, letting it settle without force, without noise. The rushlight has survived the brief excursion into the open air and burns on in the passage, its flame recovering its upright composure, its glow restored to its usual soft and wavering reach. There is the stair to consider, and the sleeping chamber above, and the innkeeper climbs the narrow steps slowly, keeping close to the wall where the boards are firmer underfoot and less likely to creak under the weight of a step. The rushlight goes up the stairwell ahead, its small illumination running along the underside of each step above, throwing pale edges into the shadow. At the top, the innkeeper pauses and listens again. A second listening, of a different quality from the first, attending now to the close sounds of the building itself, to the breathing of the sleepers behind the chamber door, to the particular hush of timber and thatch and plastered wall that makes up the texture of a house at rest. Everything that the innkeeper hears is the sound of a night proceeding without difficulty. The sleepers breathe. The building holds its warmth. The timbers make their small adjustments as the temperature of the air settles toward its coolest point. Minute contractions and shifts that produce the faintest of creaks, sounds so familiar they are barely sounds at all. Only the voice of the structure speaking quietly to itself in the way it always does in the deep part of the night. The rushlight burns on, diminished now by its long service but still present, still casting its pale tide of light along the low rafters of the upstairs passage, and the innkeeper stands within it for a long, unhurried moment, before turning back toward the stairs, leaving the sleepers to their rest, carrying the small flame downward into the waiting dark of the inn below. The chamber itself lies just beyond that door, the low door at the end of the upstairs passage, its latch of plain iron worn smooth by many hands, its threshold crossed each night by travelers arriving in ones and twos, shedding the last of the road's weight before they surrender themselves to sleep. The room behind it is not large, though it is large enough for the handful of guests the inn holds tonight, and it carries within it the particular atmosphere of a space that has been slept in by many people across many years, a warmth that is not only the warmth of bodies, but of accumulated rest itself, as though the room has absorbed something of all the sleeping that has taken place within its walls and gives it gently back. The rafters are low, closer to the head than a tall person might find easy in the middle of the room, and they run in close parallel rows of dark timber, seasoned to a deep brown by years of proximity to the chimney stack that rises through one wall, carrying the heat of the common room fire upward through the building. The plaster between the rafters is uneven, marked here and there by the shadows of old repairs, and in one corner a bundle of dried lavender has been tied to a nail driven into the wood, its fragrance faded now to something very faint and dry, present more as a memory of scent than as a true perfume, mingling with the smell of old wool and the clean dusty smell of straw. The straw is gathered into pallets, each one a long cloth sack filled to a comfortable thickness, laid out along the walls of the room and arranged with a certain practical care, enough space between them for a person to step without treading on a neighbor, though not so much space as to waste the room's warmth. Each pallet has been covered with a length of rough linen, washed and dried many times until it has achieved a soft, almost papery texture, and folded at the foot of each is a woolen blanket, heavy and loosely woven, the sort of blanket that holds warmth through its sheer density of fiber rather than through any particular refinement of craft. There is also, along one wall, a larger bedstead, a proper frame of wood, strung with rope in a crosshatch pattern to support a fuller straw mattress, and this is where the merchant has chosen to sleep, having paid a slightly greater portion of coin at the evening's reckoning for the privilege of the bed rather than the pallet. The merchant is already still, lying on his back with the blanket drawn to his chin, one hand resting flat on his chest, his breathing already slow and even. It did not take him long to settle. A man accustomed to the road finds sleep without difficulty, having learned through long practice to make use of whatever rest is offered, and to ask no more of a lodging than that it be dry and warm. His pack and his merchant's satchel are tucked beneath the bedstead, close enough to his hand that waking would bring him immediately into contact with them, though tonight there is nothing to wake for, and he lies as deeply and peacefully as a man in his own home. The two pilgrims have taken pallets, side by side, along the nearer wall. Before settling, they knelt together briefly at the foot of their pallets, heads bowed and lips moving, in the quiet recitation of an evening prayer. Not a lengthy prayer, only the final words of a devotion that had already been said in fuller form downstairs before the fire. A brief acknowledgment of the night and its shelter, a word of thanks for the miles completed and the miles still ahead. Then they rose, pulled off their outer boots, with the particular care of those who know their footwear must last the whole of a long journey, and arranged themselves on their pallets with the unhurried efficiency of experienced travelers. One of them drew the blanket up over his shoulder and settled facing the wall. The other lay on the back, eyes open for a moment to the low rafters above, then closed. Within a short time both were still. The craftsman had taken the pallet nearest the chimney stack, where the warmth from the stone is most persistent, radiating through the night long after the fire below has been banked and settled. He had not said much during the evening, and he said nothing now, sitting for a brief while on the edge of his pallet to work the lacing of his boots loose with fit, careful fingers, then setting the boots aside and placing his leather bag of tools beside them, touching the bag once as if in reassurance before lying down. He pulled the blanket around himself with a kind of deliberate thoroughness, tucking it at the sides in a way that suggested long habit, and then he lay still, and his breathing deepened very quickly, the breathing of a man whose body was already more asleep than awake, and had only been waiting for permission to let go entirely. The small shutter over the narrow window at the far end of the room is latched against the night, but the timber around it is old, and the fit is not perfect. And through the slight gap at its edge, there comes a thread of cold air, barely perceptible except as a faint freshness against the warmer air of the room, and a corresponding faint sound, the press of the autumn wind against the outside of the building, a low and steady sound that is more felt than heard, a kind of gentle insistence that reminds the room of the world beyond its walls. The wind moves through the thatch above the rafters and around the eaves, and the building receives it with the equanimity of a structure that has stood through many such nights, its walls thick enough, its roof tight enough, that the cold is kept to that single thread at the shutter's edge, and no further. The smell of the room settles around its occupants as they sleep, the dry, faintly sweet smell of straw, the lanolin warmth of old wool, the ghost of lavender from the bundle above, and beneath all of these something older and quieter, the smell of the room itself, of plastered wall and aged timber, of the accumulated time of a building that has sheltered many such nights as this one. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is the smell of shelter, of a place that has done what it was built to do across many seasons, and it carries within it a quality of reassurance that is perhaps felt without being consciously recognized by the sleeping travelers, a quality that simply makes the body willing to rest. The room has grown quieter by degrees, each small sound of settling and arranging giving way to the next, until there are no more such sounds, until the last rustle of straw beneath a shifting body has stilled, the last quiet exhalation of wakefulness has passed into the slower rhythm of true sleep. Now the room breathes collectively, 3 or 4 different rhythms that do not quite synchronize, but exist in a kind of loose accord, rising and falling in their separate times, filling the low space between the pallets and the rafters with the sound of rest. It is a sound that belongs entirely to this hour, particular to a room where bodies have surrendered the day and given themselves over to the long work of sleep. The wind presses again at the shutter, soft and unhurried, and the building holds firm around its sleeping guests. The straw does not shift. The blankets lie heavy and still. The dried lavender releases its faint breath into the air above the pallets, and the chimney stack continues its patient giving of warmth through the long wall hour by quiet hour. There is nothing left in this room that needs attending to. The road, the mud, the miles, the cold, all of it has been set aside, as surely as the boots lined up beside the pallets, and the travelers lie within the shelter of the inn, as deeply and as fully at rest as the night itself, which moves on above the thatch in its own slow, unhurried passage toward the far hours ahead. The common room lies empty now. The last candle was extinguished some time ago, and the darkness that followed has settled fully into every corner, pooling beneath the benches and along the base of the walls, softening the edges of the trestle tables until they are little more than dark shapes, arranged in the familiar geometry of a room at rest. The only light remaining is the light of the fire, and it is not the bright, sociable fire of the earlier evening, leaping and casting its warmth across the faces of the gathered travelers. It is something quieter than that, something older and more patient. The coals glow beneath a thin layer of ash, orange and deep red in shifting gradations, as if the fire has drawn inward to its own center and settled there, content to breathe slowly through the long hours of the night. The innkeeper banked it carefully before retiring, pressing the ash over the coals with practiced hands, leaving just enough air beneath to sustain the slow combustion that will hold warmth in the room until morning. This is an art learned over many years and many winters, the particular judgment of how much fuel and how much air and how much covering of ash will carry the hearth through the dark hours without letting it die entirely or flare up untended. The fire as it now burns is the result of that quiet expertise, and it performs its patient work without any further instruction, hour after hour, steady and self-sufficient in its bed of coals. The warmth it throws into the room is faint and diffuse, nothing like the direct heat of a full blaze. It spreads outward in a low, gentle radiation that barely reaches the far wall, but touches the nearest bench with something like softness, warming the wood to a temperature just above the cool of the surrounding air. The surface of the long trestle table closest to the hearth holds this warmth in its grain, and the rough-hewn bench beside it does the same, each piece of heavy oak, retaining what the fire has given it through the earlier hours of the evening. The ale jug, returned to its shelf, sits in the dimness with its clay sides still faintly warm from the proximity of the hearth. Even the packed earth of the floor, where countless boots have worn it smooth over many years, holds a residual warmth near the hearthstone that the night air has not yet reached. The coals shift occasionally, very slightly, as the material within them continues its slow transformation. A piece of wood that is burned almost entirely through will settle a fraction, and the movement sends a brief brightening through the bed of coals, a pulse of deeper orange that strengthens for a moment and then subsides, and a small drift of ash lifts and falls again at the edge of the hearthstone. These are small events, unhurried and without consequence, the ordinary processes of fire completing itself in its own time. The faint hiss that accompanies the settling is barely audible in the stillness, a sound less heard than sensed, a soft exhalation from the last moisture held deep in the wood, releasing now into the warm air of the chimney above. The chimney draws slowly at this hour, its pulse steady and gentle, carrying the thin thread of smoke upward through the stone throat and out above the thatch into the cold night air. Below, the common room receives the faint, familiar smell of wood smoke that has been present here so long it has become part of the room itself, embedded in the timber of the walls and the grain of the furniture, and the packed clay of the ceiling between the beams. It is not an unpleasant smell. It is warm and old and entirely suited to the room that holds it. The timber of the inn settles into the coolness of the night, with small, barely perceptible sounds, a tick from somewhere in the wall above the door, a low creak from one of the roof beams, contracting as the temperature outside continues to fall. These sounds carry no particular significance. They are the sounds of wood responding to the world around it, expanding and contracting with heat and cold as it has always done, as it will continue to do through countless more nights, long after this particular midnight has passed into morning. The building accommodates these small adjustments without distress, its heavy timber frame holding firm, while the lesser members of its construction speak quietly to one another, in the language of expansion and settling. The shuttered windows do not rattle tonight. The wind that earlier pressed and moved against them has eased to something gentler, a long, low movement of air through the yard and past the walls of the inn, finding the gaps around the shutter edges but not insisting upon them. A thin thread of cold air enters along the sill of the nearest window and descends to the floor, where it spreads out in a barely perceptible current along the base of the wall before the warmth of the room absorbs it and neutralizes it entirely. The room maintains its temperature in this quiet negotiation between the warmth stored in its walls and furniture and the coolness that the night presses inward at every seam. On the shelf beside the extinguished candles, a small puddle of hardened tallow has formed around the base of one wick, pale and opaque in the dim red light from the hearth. The other candles stand in their holders with their wicks dark, their work done for the night, their soft shapes casting no shadows now. The pewter cups that remain on the shelf reflect the glow of the coals in long, distorted curves of orange and dark, moving slightly as the fire shifts below, so that the shelf seems to hold a kind of slow secondary fire within the curved surfaces of the metal. A smaller and more distant version of the light that originates from the hearth. The benches stand where they were left, drawn back slightly from the tables by the last guests to use them, as people naturally leave furniture when they rise and move away toward sleep. One bench sits at a slight angle, not quite parallel to the table it accompanied through the evening, and this small asymmetry is the only sign remaining of the human presence that filled the room some hours ago. The cups have been collected, and the board has been cleared. The bread and the remnants of supper are in the kitchen. There is nothing on the tables now but the undisturbed surface of the old wood, and the darkness that rests upon it as lightly as cloth. It is very quiet, not the quiet of absence exactly, but the quiet of a room that is full of resting things, timber and stone and iron and clay, and the slow fire and the barely moving air, all of them present and occupying their places. The inn does not feel empty so much as it feels inhabited by its own stillness, settled into the midnight, the way a stone settles into a riverbed, surrounded and held and entirely at rest within its element. The coals breathe their orange light across the hearthstone and out into the room in slow, patient pulses. The ash at the edge of the firebed is the color of pale chalk in the dim light, fine and undisturbed. A faint warmth moves through the room as if the building itself were breathing, drawing in the coolness of the night through its small gaps and openings, and returning it warmed and softened through the heat held in its walls and its great central hearth. The fire is not watched by any waking eye. It has no audience tonight. It burns because burning is what fire does, slowly and without need of witness, sustaining the warmth of the common room through the long center of the night, as it has sustained it through the long centers of many hundreds of nights before this one, and will again in all the quiet midnights still to come. Beyond the walls of the inn, the world has grown very still. The road that brought the travelers here through the long afternoon, that winding country track of packed earth and ruts and autumn mud, lies empty now in the deep of night, stretching away in both directions into a darkness that has no particular edge. Earlier in the evening, the inn's torch burned at the front of the yard, throwing a warm orange circle of light across the worn stone step and the nearest stretch of road, casting the puddles and the ruts into brief copper brightness. But the torch has been extinguished now, put out by the innkeeper's careful hand during the evening rounds, and the building presents itself to the night without that beacon. Only the faintest suggestion of warmth glows through a gap in one of the shuttered windows, a thread of amber light, thin as a seam in cloth, escaping from the banked hearth inside and reaching no more than a foot or two into the yard before the darkness absorbs it entirely. The night is overcast in places, the clouds moving slowly from the west in long, soft banks that alternately cover and uncover whatever moon there may be. When the clouds part, the road catches a pale silver light, and the puddles in the wheel ruts become small mirrors, each one holding a fragment of sky within its still surface, a smear of moonlight, the ghost of a star, the faint reflection of a bare hedgerow branch reaching over the track from one side. When the clouds close again, the road disappears into a darkness so complete and even that it seems less like the absence of light and more like a presence of its own, something deep and soft and without boundary, settled over the landscape, the way wool settles over a sleeping form. The fields on either side of the road lie flat and quiet under the cold air. The harvest was brought in some weeks ago, and the stubble remaining in the broad strips of open field has been pressed down by rain and frost into a low silvered mat that shifts very faintly when the wind moves across it. There is no motion here that is hurried or urgent. The wind itself, when it comes, moves slowly, pressing through the stubble and across the ruts of the road and against the inn's thatched roof, with a sound so gradual and gentle that it seems less like wind and more like the slow exhalation of the earth itself. In the fields, the soil is cold and heavy with moisture, dark beneath the pale stubble, holding the memory of the season's work in its compacted surface. The hedgerows that border the road and divide one field from the next are dense and intricate, their branches bare now of most leaves, their roots deep in the mounded earth of the hedge banks. Within those banks, in the interlocking network of roots and soil and packed dry grass, small creatures have arranged themselves for the night. A field mouse is curled in a hollow close to the ground, its tiny body rounded into itself for warmth, its breathing so shallow and even that it does not stir the dry grass around it. Somewhere deeper, in the roots of an old hawthorn, a dormouse rests in the deeper sleep of the season's cold, its brown fur soft against the dried leaves it has gathered around itself over many quiet days and nights. Wrens, small and fierce in their industry, have tucked themselves into gaps in the hedgerow branches, feathers fluffed against the cold air, holding their warmth through the long dark. None of them are troubled. None of them require the night to be otherwise than it is. They have arranged themselves within it with the perfect simplicity of creatures that know no other way of being. An owl moves somewhere across the far field, not near the road, not near the inn, its passage through the air entirely silent, its broad wings making no more sound than the movement of smoke. It crosses from one stand of trees to another, and is gone from any possible sight, absorbed back into the general darkness of the landscape, as though it were made of the same material. The trees at the edge of the near field, a small stand of oak and ash that has grown there through many generations, their trunks thick and darkened with age, are entirely still when the wind is still. Their bare upper branches make a fine, intricate pattern against the slightly lighter darkness of the overcast sky, a tracery of lines that is endlessly complex and entirely without urgency. The oldest of the oaks has held that shape for longer than the inn has stood beside the road. Its roots go down through layers of soil and clay into something older than the road, older than the field, older than the hedge that now runs along its southern side. It stands in the cold night with the same undemonstrative patience it has always brought to standing, its bark damp with the collected moisture of the air, its few remaining dried leaves still clinging to the lower branches with the particular stubbornness of oak leaves in autumn, trembling only very slightly when the wind returns. The road stretches away northward into the dark. A traveler who might walk it now would find nothing along its length for some miles, no light, no voice, no fire, no building. The fields would open and close on either side, the hedgerows would pass and give way to open ground and then to hedgerows again, and the track itself would narrow and widen according to the logic of the land it crosses. Bending around the edge of a low rise, dipping through the soft ground near a small stream, pressing across a stretch of heavier clay where the ruts are deepest and the going is slow, even in better weather than this. But no one walks the road tonight. It belongs entirely to the cold air and the occasional wind, and the pale fragments of moonlight that find their way through the moving clouds. Behind the travelers, to the south, the road disappears in the same way, into the same unlit countryside, the same quiet fields, the same network of hedgerows and old trees, and unseen small things at their rest. The whole of the rural world beyond the inn's walls is held in a stillness so even and so complete that the faint amber thread, escaping through the inn's shutter, seems from any distance at all, not like evidence of wakefulness, but like a remnant warmth, a memory of the fire that burns inside, marking the place of the building the way a coal marks its own position in the dark of a banked hearth, not brightly, not urgently, but steadily, and without need of notice. The inn sits within this landscape as it has always sat, a small, warm, timber-framed thing beside a country road, surrounded by the enormous and undemanding quiet of the night. Its thatch holds the cold air on its upper surface, and the warmth of the rooms below within its dense interior. Its walls, lime-washed and darkened by the wet of the season, reflect nothing and absorb everything. The water trough holds a still surface of water that mirrors, when the clouds allow, the faintest suggestion of stars. The stable is quiet, the door is barred, and the road runs past all of it without pausing, north and south, into the dark, unhurried and unmarked, carrying nothing tonight but the cold and the silence and the slow passage of the hours toward morning. The small hours settle over the inn the way a heavy blanket settles over a sleeping form. Slowly, without announcement, pressing gently into every corner and fold of the building, until the darkness and the quiet are one continuous thing, indistinguishable from each other. There is no sharp boundary marking the passage from late night into the small hours. The change is gradual and soft, a deepening of what was already deep, a further slowing of what was already slow. In the sleeping chamber above the common room, the travelers have long since ceased their quiet adjustments, and their murmured arrangements and their small domestic negotiations with blanket and pallet and pillow of folded cloth. They lie now in the full depth of sleep, each body having found its angle of repose against the straw and the rough wool beneath, and having stilled there. The merchant lies on his back, one arm curved loosely at his side, his breath so even and so quiet that it barely stirs the air above him. The pilgrims are close together for warmth, their coats pulled up over their shoulders, their faces turned inward, in the manner of people at genuine rest. The craftsman has rolled toward the wall, drawn his knees slightly upward in the instinctive posture of warmth conservation that the body knows without instruction, and his breathing carries a faint depth to it, not quite a sound but a presence, a rhythm that moves through the room like the slowest possible tide. The room itself breathes with them. The low rafters hold the warmth that the bodies below have given up into the air, and that warmth remains among the beams in a gentle, invisible layer. The straw of the pallets has taken on the particular compressed softness that only comes after hours of wait, and the smell of it, dry and faintly sweet and very old, mingles with the smell of wool and the faint trace of tallow from a candle long since burned to nothing. The narrow shutter over the window is closed tight against the cold, and the darkness inside the room is complete, the kind of darkness that has texture and weight, that rests against closed eyelids as something almost tangible. Somewhere beneath the threshold of hearing, one of the sleepers shifts. It is not waking. It is the deep, involuntary movement of a body that has lain too long in one position and adjusts itself without any participation from the mind. A shoulder rolling back, a knee drawing down, a slow resettling of weight from one side to the other. The straw sighs a little under the movement, a sound so small it does not disturb the silence so much as prove it. Demonstrate its depth by passing through it without leaving a mark. The dreaming, if there is dreaming, is its own country, invisible and unhearable, belonging entirely to each sleeping person alone. What passes through the mind of the merchant in his sleep? What roads or counting houses or familiar faces his dreaming mind assembles from the materials of the day and the deeper stores of his years, this cannot be known. The pilgrims may dream of their destination, of the shine they travel toward, of something gentle and bright that the waking mind cannot quite hold. The craftsman perhaps dreams of nothing articulate at all, only the warm and formless sense of rest that the body offers to itself in the deep hours, the simple and complete experience of not being required. Below the sleeping chamber, the common room lies in its midnight stillness, the fire on the banked hearth breathing in its long, slow, ember-warm breath, casting no more light than is needed to mark the shapes of the tables and benches as darker shapes within the darkness. The room holds the smell of the evening, wood smoke and ale and the ghost of the supper, bread and pottage and the faint animal richness of tallow, and these smells have settled into the timbers and the rushes on the floor in the way that smells do in old rooms, becoming part of the fabric of the place rather than evidence of any particular night. The kitchen beyond lies quieter still. The cook has been asleep for some time now, folded into her pallet in the small room off the kitchen passage. Her breathing is steady and unremarkable as a hearthstone, her hands so busy through all the waking hours, lying open and still at last against the blanket. The kitchen fire, banked to a long and patient survival, holds a single coal of true brightness at its center, surrounded by the gray and white gradations of ash. This one small brightness is sufficient to maintain the warmth of the kitchen through the night hours, drawing no attention to itself, asking nothing, simply persisting in its quiet way until the morning comes and it is called upon again. Out across the yard, in the stable, the horses stand in their stalls in the deepest ease of their own resting. Horses do not sleep in the way that people sleep, but they rest with a completeness that is its own kind of departure from the waking world. Heads low, weight settled back on haunches, each animal quiet in its particular stall, the breath moving in long, slow exhalations that just barely stir the wisps of hay closest to the muzzle. The stable boy is long gone, tucked into his sleeping place at the end of the stable passage, and the animals are alone with the darkness and the warmth of their own bodies, and the smell of hay and damp straw, and the rich, patient smell of horses at rest. Occasionally one of them shifts its weight, moving a hoof across the straw floor with a sound that is muffled and soft, a movement that settles back into stillness almost before it has fully registered. The animals are not troubled. The night presses around the stable walls in perfect quiet. Throughout the inn, in all its small rooms and passages and corners, the evidence of sleeping life is gentle and continuous. The slow rhythm of breath here, the soft compression of straw there, the faint warmth of a body against a blanket, the quiet absence of any need or urgency or directed thought. The building holds all of this within its timber frame and its thick thatch, without effort, containing the sleepers the way a cupped hand contains water, without pressure, simply offering the shape of shelter and allowing rest to deepen inside it. The hours move through the dark without announcement. There is no clock to mark them in this place, no bell close enough to carry through the night air and reach the shuttered windows. Time passes the way water passes through deep still ground, present and continuous and entirely without haste, moving forward only because moving forward is what time does, not because there is anywhere particular that it needs to arrive. The small hours extend themselves in this unhurried way, one breath following the next, one moment of stillness giving way to another moment equally still. The inn and everyone within it suspended in the long, even, wordless continuance of sleep. There comes an hour, in the long passage of the night that sits apart from all the others, not the hour of deepest dark, which belongs to midnight, and not the hour of first stirring, which belongs to dawn, but the hour that lies between them, when night has given everything it has to give, and morning has not yet gathered the will to begin. This is the hour before first light. It is the quietest hour the world contains, and the inn, in this particular moment, rests within it as completely and as trustingly as a stone rests at the bottom of a still pool. The fire on the common room hearth has burned itself down through the long course of the night, until what remains is not flame at all, but something quieter and more patient. A deep bed of coals that glow with a faint, steady warmth, orange shading into red, shading into a dull and sourceless rose, covered at the edges by a thin drift of pale ash that shifts imperceptibly with each tiny movement of air in the room. The warmth that rises from this bed of coals is not the assertive warmth of a burning fire, but something softer and more diffuse, a warmth that does not announce itself, but simply exists in the air of the room, like a presence that has been there so long it has become indistinguishable from the room itself. The iron crane above the hearth is still, the hanging chain motionless. The earthenware and pewter on the shelves catch no flicker, because there is no flicker left to catch, only that low, even, breathing glow from the coals, steady and unhurried, as if the fire, too, has entered into its own kind of sleep. The cold that comes in the hour before dawn is a particular kind of cold, not sharp, not biting, but slow and thorough, the cold of a world that has been releasing its warmth all night into a dark sky, and has now reached the furthest extent of that release. It finds its way into the inn, through the small gaps that all old buildings possess, the fine seam where the heavy door meets its frame, the narrow space beneath the threshold stone, where the wood has worn and settled over many years, the places where daub has drawn back slightly from the timber behind it, leaving a passage no wider than a finger. Through these small channels the cold air moves without haste, spreading across the floor of the common room in a thin layer that barely rises above the level of the rushes, cold enough to be felt by any hand held low to the ground, but not cold enough to reach the sleepers upstairs, who are well above it, wrapped in their blankets, their breath rising in faint pale clouds in the chill of the sleeping chamber. Upstairs, the travelers lie at the furthest depth of their rest. The merchant, who spent the first part of the night shifting and settling, turning from one side to the other, as the body sometimes does when the mind is slow to release its preoccupations, is now entirely still, his breathing long and even, his hands relaxed against the rough wool of his blanket. The two pilgrims lie close together for warmth, as they have no doubt lain on many nights of their journey, their cloaks spread over the blankets as an additional layer against the cold of the small hours. The craftsman sleeps on his side, one arm folded beneath him, his chest rising and falling with a slowness that belongs entirely to deep, untroubled sleep. None of them move, none of them make any sound beyond the soft, barely audible rhythm of their breathing. They are as far from waking as they will be at any point in the night, carried down into rest by all the accumulated weariness of the road. The innkeeper, too, sleeps without movement now, in the small room off the kitchen passage, that has been the innkeeper's room through many years and many seasons of this work. The rushlight was extinguished long ago. The room is dark and close and warm enough, and the innkeeper's breathing is slow and regular, the breathing of someone who has worked hard through a long day, and has, in sleep, set all of that down completely. There is something settled about the quality of sleep in this hour, something that speaks of the body having found its resting point, and being content to remain there for as long as the darkness holds. In the kitchen, the banked fire has done its slow work through the night, its heat seeping into the stone of the hearth and the walls around it, and that stored warmth radiates gently outward now into the cold air of the room. The bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters are invisible in the darkness, but their faint dry scent is still present in the air, mixed with the smell of ash and the cold iron of the pot. The kitchen is very still. The stone floor holds the dark without reflection. Everything in the room is where it was left at the end of the evening's work, and everything rests in its place without urgency, without expectation. Outside, the road is a pale and empty thing, barely distinguishable from the dark fields on either side of it. No moon is visible. The sky is a deep and uniform dark, the kind of dark that comes in the last hour before the light begins to change, when the stars that were visible earlier in the night have moved toward the west, and the sky has not yet begun to carry any suggestion of what is to come. The hedgerows stand without movement. The fields lie open and quiet. No creature calls. No wind stirs the bare branches of the trees along the verge. The world outside the inn is held in a stillness so complete that it seems almost like a held breath, the pause before the exhale, the moment of deepest rest before the slow and inevitable turn begins. The inn itself seems aware of this quality, if a building can be said to be aware of anything. Its timbers are settled and quiet, their creaking done for the night. Its thatch presses close against the cold air above, holding the warmth inside as it was built to do. Its walls stand in the dark without effort, patient and thick and entirely sufficient for the purpose of shelter. And within those walls, the sleepers continue their slow, deep, untroubled breathing, each one held within the building's quiet as easily and as gently as a flame is held within a lantern, present, warm, sustained, and entirely at rest. The night gathered close around them all. And then, so gradually that it would be impossible to name the precise moment it begins, something shifts at the very edge of things. It is not light, not yet, not anything that could be called light in any meaningful sense. It is more the absence of a particular quality of darkness, a faint and almost theoretical softening at the seam where the wooden shutters meet their frames, as though the night just beyond the timber walls has become, by the smallest of degrees, less absolute. The change is so subtle that no sleeping person would perceive it, and even a waking one, standing still in the room and watching carefully, might question whether the eye was simply adjusting to what had always been there, or whether something truly new had begun to gather at the edge of the world. But it is there. The gray is there, pale as ash, thin as the finest linen held up to a distant candle, present in the way that a thought is present, just before it becomes clear enough to name. It pools at the very margins of the shutters, along the top edge, where a sliver of outside air has always found its way through, and it does not advance so much as simply deepen its quiet presence, moment by moment, in no hurry whatsoever, as though it has all the patience that the night itself has had, and more. Inside the sleeping chamber, nothing stirs. The travelers lie as they have lain through these long hours, their breathing slow and even beneath the weight of woolen blankets, their bodies entirely surrendered to the straw pallets and the shared warmth of the room. The merchant has shifted at some point in the small hours, turning onto one side, and now lies with one hand loosely curled beside his face, his expression open and unguarded in the way that sleep permits. The pilgrims are close together, their cloaks pulled up over their blankets for additional warmth, and they breathe almost in unison, their rest so deep that it seems to carry something of the devotion they brought with them on the road, a quietude that is almost like prayer, settled and unhurried. The craftsman sleeps on his back, one arm stretched above his head, entirely still. The room holds them all. The low rafters press close overhead, dark with old smoke and the accumulated years of the building's life, and the small shutter at the narrow window holds firm against the morning that is gathering itself so slowly outside. The smell of dried herbs and old wool is unchanged, as soft and familiar as it has been through every hour of the night, and the cold that sits at the edges of the room, in the corners near the floor, along the wall that faces the yard, is the same gentle, bearable cold it has always been. Nothing is different, and yet the light at the edge of the shutters continues its patient work, its gray growing by increments too small to measure. Somewhere beyond the yard, at a distance that is difficult to determine, perhaps in the hedgerow at the far side of the road, or further still, in the thicket of bare trees beyond the field, a bird makes a sound. It is a single note, brief and tentative, not a true song but something more like a question, or perhaps simply a sound made in half-sleep, as an animal stirs in its nest and settles again without fully waking. The note hangs in the air for a moment and then is gone, absorbed by the vast quiet that surrounds it, and after it, the silence is, if anything, a little deeper than before, the way a room can feel more still after a candle is snuffed, as though the absence of the sound has made the surrounding quiet more present, more deliberate, more soft. In the stable, the horses breathe their long, warm breaths. They have slept in the way that horses sleep, lightly, as a rule, their bodies arranged in the easy postures of rest, their heads low and their eyes half closed. One of them shifts its weight now, moving a hind foot slightly on the straw, and the sound is a small, dry rustle that moves through the stable and then disappears into the timbers. The horn lantern has long since burned out. There is no light at all in the stable, and the darkness there is the same warm, animal-scented darkness it has been since the stable boy banked his last observations and retreated to his own rest. The straw is deep and dry underfoot. The animals are comfortable. They want for nothing, and the night holds them as the straw holds them, softly, thoroughly, without effort. The stable boy himself lies in the small space at the end of the stable that has been his bed on many such nights, a narrow corner well insulated by proximity to the horses and to the accumulated warmth of the building itself. He sleeps with the directness and totality of the very young and the very tired, his breathing audible even over the quiet of the horses, and at some point in this pale pre-dawn hour, his face shifts slightly, some small expression moving across it, and then releasing, as though something in the body knows, even in sleep, that the night is thinning. He does not wake. He will not wake for some time yet, but there is the faintest change in the quality of his stillness, as though a deep-buried instinct is already, very slowly beginning to surface through the layers of his sleep. In the kitchen, the banked fire breathes its slow coals. The layer of ash over the embers is thick and white and undisturbed, and beneath it, the heat persists in the way that heat always persists in a well-banked fire, patient and reliable, giving nothing away unnecessarily, conserving itself for the morning when it will be asked to wake and work again. The kitchen is very cold, beyond the fire's immediate influence. The stone floor has lost whatever warmth it briefly held, and the bundles of dried herbs hang motionless from the rafters in the cold air, their scents faint at this hour, present but subdued, like a memory of the day's cooking rather than the thing itself. The cook sleeps nearby, and the maidservant, and the house is entirely quiet. In the common room the hearth holds its last warmth. The embers have settled further in these final hours, compressing themselves into a dense, orange-red core that radiates its heat with great steadiness and very little light, just enough of a glow to suggest the shape of the hearthstones, just enough warmth to keep the room from the full bite of the autumn night. The long trestle tables stand empty, the benches pushed in close beside them, the pewter and earthenware on their shelves dim in the absence of candlelight. The room is patient. It has been patient all night, and it is patient now, holding its breath alongside the inn and the road and the fields, waiting without urgency for whatever comes next. And what comes next comes slowly. The gray at the edge of the shutters deepens, or rather brightens, though brightened is far too strong a word for what is happening, which is more like a very gentle exhale from the darkness, a loosening of the night's hold on the color of things. The topmost edge of light at the shutter's frame is, perhaps, the shade of pewter now, rather than ash. The change is real. It is happening. It is simply in no hurry, and there is great comfort in that. Great steadiness in the way the morning comes to this place, without drama, without announcement, arriving as the most natural thing in the world because it is exactly that, arriving as it has arrived over this building and this road and these fields through every season of the inn's long life, and every season before the inn existed, and every season before there was anyone to notice or to name what they were seeing. The sleepers in the chamber above do not notice. The horses in the stable do not notice. The coals in the kitchen and the hearth do not notice. The gray comes nonetheless, patient and sure, pressing gently at the edges of the shuttered windows and the gaps in the door and the small unchinked places in the timber walls where the outside world and the inside world have always been in quiet conversation with each other. There is still rest here. There is still a great deal of night contained within these walls, still the deep, unhurried breathing of people who will sleep for some time yet, still the warmth of embers that have no interest in the hour, still the soft, anonymous dark of the stable and the kitchen and the passage and the yard. The morning is at the edges only. It has not entered. It waits with the same patience that everything in this story has shown, the patience of the road after the travelers have passed, of the fire after the guests have gone to bed, of the inn itself standing in the dark with its thatch and its timber and its wide, quiet walls, sheltering what it has always sheltered, holding what it has always held. And so the gray light gathers softly at the margins of this resting place, and the inn holds its sleepers, and the morning comes as all mornings come, not rushing, not announcing itself, but arriving, little by little, the way warmth spreads from a fire, or the way a breath is let go after a long and peaceful night, gently and at its own unhurried pace, into the quiet of the gathering day.